Are you ready for the entertainment experience of a lifetime? Knockdown, drag-out, hard-hitting conversations, debates, and interviews. Well, if you said yes to any of these questions, sit back, relax, and enjoy something like no other. This is the Isolation Series podcast, presented by the Scott Robles team at Douglas Elliman Real Estate, by wellbeingsperformance.com for all your online meeting needs, by Barbarian Steakhouse, Canada's premier upscale restaurant. For more information, go to barbarians.com, by imprintpilates.com Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area's premier Pilates studio, and by the Toronto Immune and Digestive Health Institute. For more information, go to tidhi.ca. Here now is your host, Spencer Miller.
Hey guys, and welcome to today's Wednesday edition of the Isolation Series. Me, Spencer Miller, and my co-host, Paul Shields. But, Paul, we are very pleased to welcome a dear friend of mine and longtime sports aficionado to the Isolation Series for the very first time today. He is the one and only Paul Bruno. And Paul, welcome to the Isolation Series for the very first time, my friend.
Great to be with you, Spence.
Yes. Let's jump right in. Last night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, the Hall of Fame induction took place or not the induction took place, but the announcement took place in the hallowed halls of Cooperstown, and only one new member will be joining those hallowed halls as of July 24th of 2022, and that is the legendary Boston Red Sox slugger David Ortiz. Now, what are your thoughts on that, especially with it being Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and Curt Schilling's last attempt to be on the player ballot?
Well, clearly the phrase character matters to the Hall of Fame induction process, and it is part of the definition of qualification. So that's the one thing that sets Ortiz apart. But Spencer, I have a hard time leaving out some of the all-time greats on the top of the leaderboards, and you mentioned the other guys, but they all have character issues or issues with rumors about PED use. David Ortiz had those too, but the fact is he had a much better relationship with the media. They all had great numbers, and they should all be in my opinion. It's the Hall of Fame. It should have been for what they did between the white lines, the players, not all this ancillary stuff.
Right. And the argument has been made by multiple pundits since the announcement went down last night at 6 p.m. Eastern, that, if you look at Clemens' numbers and you look at Bond's numbers before they allegedly started using PEDs, they would have been on a track to be a Hall of Famer without doing PEDs. Obviously, we don't know specifically the year that each of them started using PEDs. We can guess based on the fact that Barry Bonds' head grew like 4 sizes in one off season or whatever it was. But isn't that another side that is kind of sad to you as well? Because it's sad to me. I don't agree with cheaters, and you don't agree with cheaters either, especially when we've been very fortunate to see some great Hall of Famers throughout our time as well, whether it be Ken Griffey Jr. or Roberto Alomar or whatever the case may be, where they did it without any type of performance-enhancing drug whatsoever. But it is sad when you know that Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens specifically would have been on a trajectory to the Hall if they had not even touched those things.
Absolutely correct. Both of them were at the top of their game before they touched allegedly touched the PEDs. I think Barry Bonds had multiple Gold Gloves, multiple MVPs, and Cy Young awards were commonplace for Roger Clemens pitching in the bandbox known as Fenway Park, which is the numbers that he put up pitching in that park before any link to steroid use. That's astronomical what he did there, and that was before they qualified themselves, like you said, for inclusion or consideration in the Hall before any rumors came out. And let's face it, do you really believe that they were the only 3 or 4 people in the pros that were dealing with PEDs during their era? I think the league was rife with performance enhancing drugs, and even before this era, dating back to the 60s, when Jim Bouton wrote Ball 4 and the exploits of all the players he was with, we were hearing about bennies, uppers, and all the rest. What do you think that was? Those were performance enhancing drugs, and they help people get over injuries faster. This is not new. What we saw during the era of the guys who were considered.
Yeah, and if you remember, Paul, during that time, especially in the summer of the Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire, Ken Griffey Jr. home run chase, initially in 1998, which really engaged fans back into the game during that summer for the first time since the 1994 strike. One of their most successful ad campaigns that I will forever remember is Greg Maddux and John Smoltz and Tom Glavine doing workouts and things like that, and doing the whole Chicks Dig the Long Ball campaign, which I thought was great. So obviously during that time, baseball was embracing it, especially because of coming off of a strike and wanting to re-engage fans. And that summer was a magical summer. The numbers were the highest that we saw them in years, and I don't think they've been that high for a long, long time since then. And I want to throw it to you, Mr. Paul Shields, because I know that this is an interesting topic of conversation, and undoubtedly you must have your 2 cents on what Paul and I have been talking about.
Sure, and thanks, Spence, and welcome, Paul. You mentioned character being a qualifier for the Hall of Fame, but where do you think that line gets drawn? Because there's no doubt that Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds are 2 of the best players to ever play the game, and there's players in the Hall of Fame who have done pretty horrible things or alleged to have done pretty horrible things. So where does that line fall for you? These guys are among, like you said, a list of players, including Big Papi, who were on that initial report that said that could be a thing. So where, it feels like it's becoming more and more subjective as the years go on.
I'll give you an analogy. When they put out the chalk lines at the beginning of the game around the batter's box, how long before those are obscured? It's likely 1 or 2 batters in. And those lines have been obscured by the voting process from the beginning of time. They say it, but they don't enforce it when they talk about the strictest definition of qualification. But the guys that don't like Barry Bonds and company, they trot it out now because it's convenient to their case. But Ty Cobb was alleged to have killed somebody. And so there are issues where it's indisputable that what the guy has done off the field has impacted his chances. And so I just think that if you're talking about the history of the game, which should be captured in the Hall of Fame, it should tell the entire story, good, bad, or indifferent. Maybe you want to put an extra line on the plaques of these guys that when they get in and say they were using or they weren't. But the fact is, Paul, in the case of these 3 guys, none of them was actually convicted of PED use. And that includes David Ortiz, Barry Bonds, and Roger Clemens. So what are we talking about here? It's just hearsay. And yet decisions have been made based on all this hearsay.
Right. And I want to get your thoughts also on the changing of the game from when myself and yourself and Paul were privy to some great pitchers, whether it be Jack Morris or Mark Burley or Roy Halladay or some of these workhorses that undoubtedly went out there every 5 days and threw 8-9 innings easy. And if you tried to take the ball away from them, they would stare you down and whatever else and things like that. So my question to you is, because we are on the topic of the Hall of Fame, how moving forward do you think a committee like that and the Hall of Fame will look at pitchers from here on out? Because yes, there are some great pitchers in the Hall of Fame based on those merits that I just mentioned.
Right.
But when you're getting pulled in the 4th and 5th and 6th innings of games on the regular now, even when you are an ace like Garrett Cole or whatever the case may be, because of analytics telling you you don't want to have your starting pitcher go third time through the order, how is that going to affect pitchers getting into the Hall of Fame for years to come? Because it makes me really sad, because you and I, like I said, and Paul also got a chance to watch some great people, including Jack Morris, throw a 10-inning game in the playoffs.
Well, Spencer, you led right into what I was going to say to you. I interviewed Jack Morris not too many years ago, a couple of years ago at a Sports Expo show here in Toronto. And I asked him specifically about that 10-inning game and in light of what pitchers are doing now. And I said, how much longer could you have gone in that game? He says, Paul, I could have gone forever. It was the last game of the season. And I was used to throwing 110, 120. I would have gone up to 160, 180. It was my last game. Who cares? I don't care if my arm falls off. The World Series was on the line. And that was the intensity that he brought to the game. But more to your point, in terms of comparing pitchers from one era to the next, the stars will be the stars. Look at Roy Halladay. He was the last pitcher that we could look at as a guy who was a threat to pitch 9 innings every time out. And in his era, his complete game ratio versus career starts, it rates very poorly against people from a prior era. So the way to measure these guys in terms of whether they qualify for Hall of Fame or not is, were they at the top of the game when they were playing? I don't think you can play history against the individual eras. So the idea is, were they at the top of the game in the 10 or 15 years they were around? And Halladay certainly qualified in that way. You can look at some of the top strikeout guys now and say, that's a way to measure these players and how their whip, all the new stats that are out there. How do they rate among their peers while they're playing? I think that's going to be the way that they make or don't make the Hall of Fame going forward.
Yeah. The only two people, and you and I talked about this off air as well the other day, the only two people that remind me of an old school mentality pitcher nowadays is Max Scherzer, now with the New York Mets, and Justin Verlander, just coming back off of Tommy John, back with the Houston Astros at the age of 39. Those are the only two left, in my opinion,
Right.
of that hardworking, threat to throw 9 innings every time out type of breed. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely do. I think there's something magical in the blueprints that all the teams use, the bullpen coaches and the pitching coaches. They're always shutting the starter down right around 100 pitches, like it's some magical mark. And there is some statistical data that shows that pitchers tend to weaken. The opposing batting average is rising significantly. But I think you got to go on a case-by-case basis. Remember a couple of years ago when Tampa pulled their ace starter in the World Series? He was rolling along after 6 innings and had like a 2-hitter going, but he was nearing that 100-pitch mark. They pulled him, and then all hell broke loose, and they lost the game.
That's Blake Snell, yes.
Right, that's right. So sometimes the eye test is what should rule. And I think that's where pitching coaches and managers have kind of lost their way a little bit in terms of the feel for the game. I'd like to see them recognize when a guy's on a roll, let him roll. If he's truly losing it, you can see it. Everybody in the park knows when a pitcher's losing it.
Especially in my case, you got to let it roll, no matter if I don't want to let it roll or not, because I'm in my chair. But also, switching gears to another topic of conversation that both you and Paul Shields are very passionate about, and that is the Toronto Maple Leafs. You have been a hockey fan and a hockey historian and a Leaf fan and a Leaf historian for as long as I've known you, and you've done a lot of podcasts yourself around hockey and some books around hockey, collaborating with some other people and things like that. So my question to you is this. Paul and I have debated this on the program multiple times so far this season. Do you believe that, yes, it is great to see Jack Campbell playing at a Vezina type level so far this season? No question about that. But do you believe that all of that is sort of inconsequential, if you will, until they make some sort of a move in the playoffs? Because we saw them do great last year in the regular season. We've seen them do great in a couple of regular seasons over the last several seasons, and then they lose 3-1 leads in the playoffs like it's going out of style. So, what are your thoughts on this year's incarnation of the Toronto Maple Leafs? And then, Paul, if you want to follow up after Paul answers this, that'd be great.
Well, the Leafs are nowhere near a dynasty, but let's compare a couple of dynasties from prior eras they're in my memory bank, and I'm sure yours. The New York Islanders, they won 4 Stanley Cups in the 80s in a row. But before they won those Stanley Cups, they had some heartbreaking first round losses, one of which was against the Leafs. And the same thing happened with the Edmonton Oilers. They had some heartbreaking losses before they started to roll in the Gretzky era. So the current crop of Leaf players and the current team, they got a lot of stars on this roster too, but they just haven't learned how to win. And there's a real difference between the regular season and the playoffs. The intensity rises, and this team has gone through a couple of heartbreaking losses. Last year's being the harshest lesson, when they were the decided favorites against the Canadiens, had home ice advantage against Montreal, and they crapped the bed, didn't they? Because there were a couple of things that went wrong, and I'll try to keep it short, but it was Campbell's first try in the playoffs. At the other end of the ice, Carey Price, arguably the best Canadian-born hockey goalie still around, I would say. And so they were at a bit of a disadvantage in the nets, despite the fact that Campbell played his heart out, but the Leafs had a real mental block about Carey Price as the series progressed, in my opinion. And the other part was the coaching tactics. Why did Phil Deneau play every shift against Austin Matthews, even when the Leafs were at home? You have last change the matchup. They never strayed from that. And they were playing right into Montreal's hands, game 4, 5, 6, and 7. And that needed to change. So there were some tactical issues, as well as the inexperience factor, that caused that defeat, in my opinion. And I think this year, the challenge is going to be greater. Look at the teams they're competing against in this Atlantic Division. It's going to be a minefield. But I'm telling you here and now, I think they get past the first round. They might even get past the second, because it's time.
Right. Paul, over to you.
Sure. And that's a really great rundown, Paul. And I agree with a lot of what you said about last year's series. I'm curious your opinion on what you see in this year's team. With the loss of Zach Hyman, they have sort of replaced him by committee with the Michael Buntings and Andre Kashas of the world. So I'm curious what you like about this team that gives you the confidence that they're going to make it through and into the second round or beyond.
It's the fact that they have more players that win more battles right up and down the roster. That's the short answer to your question. I'd like to see them bolster the blue line. They have a few too many greenhorns. I'll say an old world expression from hockey history. I'll say they need more experience on the back end, and I think that will be addressed at the trade deadline. I'll bet you dollars to donuts that that's going to happen. But you mentioned a couple of the grinders that they added up front. They've got Wayne Simmons playing multiple minutes. They're getting a lot of mileage out of Jason Spezza. That fourth line is not like your typical fourth line around the NHL, which is just normally an energy line, a bunch of baggage smashers. There's a lot of skill on that fourth line, and the Leafs can kill you on any of the lines that they got, particularly now when they're splitting up their top 4 forwards. They're putting them on 3 separate lines going into tonight's action. I think that's a very smart tactical move, and it'll be interesting to see what the returns are from that particular move.
What do you think? What do you think is the catalyst, if you will, of the Maple Leafs over their last 5 or 6 games? Because Paul and I also discussed this just a couple of days ago, that yes, they won a couple of great games, but they've also made it way too close for comfort in the third period, in terms of being up, 5-2, and then only winning 6-5 or losing 5-4 in overtime, or whatever the case may be. And I understand that it is a grind and you can't win every game, but this pattern that they've developed seemingly over the last week and a half to 2 weeks is a little alarming for me. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are 2 words: Jake Muzzin. They have been without him for much of that time. They're going to be without him tonight too. And he is the stabilizer on the second pairing that's been missing. And right now they're rotating guys like Sandin, Justin Hall, Travis Dermott, Timothy Liljegren. Those are the kind of guys that are getting more minutes, and they're not ready for it. Jake Muzzin is worn and tried and true in that regard. And he had a good partnership with Justin Hall, who's also been out. They need both of those guys to come back and be healthy, and then order will be restored in terms of the depth chart. Now you're getting Dermott and Liljegren and Sandin playing more minutes than they did earlier in the year. They're going to need to get experience, and they got it at a very tough time in the schedule. The Leafs had a lot of games, and they really missed the veteran presence, particularly of Jake Muzzin back there. I think that's the only difference that I see. Once it's back in place, I think it'll be all right.
Speaking of interesting bones of contention, I want to get your thoughts quickly as well on Peter Mrazek. We know that he was out early in the season with a groin and has been battling with that on and off since then. Do you believe still that he is an adequate backup to Jack Campbell, or do you think that they need to look at potentially packaging Peter Mrazek at somewhere like the trade deadline to get a slight upgrade in the backup goaltender position, still not taking anything away from Peter Mrazek, but he hasn't been overwhelmingly good in the chances that he has had so far, in my opinion. And both Paul and I like what we've seen in small samples so far from Joseph Wall, the guy that's in the Marlies that was up for games as well, but he still needs some seasoning. So, what are your thoughts on the backup goaltending situation right now?
Well, they really have caught a bit of a break in the fact that Jack Campbell looks like the real deal, doesn't he? And he's going to get a big payday. And the answer to your question really is related to the cap that the Leafs have right now, the cap situation. And they cannot afford to re-sign Jack Campbell at, say, $5 million. That's going to be the ballpark of his new contract, I believe, and keep a guy like Peter Mrazek, who has term on his deal. The cap hit is 3.8 per year for a couple of years after this one. The Leafs are going to play out the season with both of those guys, I do believe, and take their chance at going as far as they can in the playoffs. Peter Mrazek is a guy who has had a run as a number one goalie in this league in a couple of prior starts in Detroit and Carolina, and he's done it successfully. But the last couple of years have been like this one, where he's been hurt. And that's the question mark. Can this guy finish the rest of the season? He's got to get some run here in Toronto too, because you want to be able to trade that asset in the off season and give Campbell a little bit of a rest. I'm curious to see what kind of version of Jack Campbell we get tonight, because in the last week before last, he had some bad starts and he gave up 18 goals over 4 games, his worst stretch as a Leaf. And we need him to turn that corner and turn that page. And having Mrazek dispel him from time to time will give him a chance to rediscover his game and be in top shape when the serious shooting starts.
What do you think it is about a lot of Toronto Maple Leafs players, very much similar to whether it's the Jays or the Raptors in some cases, but as soon as they leave Toronto, it appears that they discover their top end game again, and we saw flashes of his top end game in Frederik Andersen multiple times throughout his tenure as a Maple Leaf, but since he did the swap with Peter Mrazek and went to Carolina, it seems like he's playing at a different level yet again, and that's why Carolina has been able to maintain flirting with a playoff spot so far this season. What are your thoughts on that? And do you agree with me that we've seen it far too many times in baseball, basketball, and hockey, where people come to Toronto, somehow lose their game a little bit, then leave Toronto and rediscover it? And
Spencer, go ahead.
And one of the biggest examples of that for me is former Toronto Blue Jays pitcher and now incarcerated individual Esteban Loaiza came over to the Blue Jays and was absolute garbage, went to the Chicago White Sox and was the runner-up the next year for the Cy Young Award.
Well, what about the Jays lefty that won the Cy Young last year? Prior to that, he was terrible in his career. He comes here and becomes the Cy Young winner. It goes both ways, my friend, and there's lots of examples about that. You mentioned Andre Kasha. He's he in Boston is reviled. Jack Edwards, the play-by-play man, had some nasty things to say about him when the Leafs first played there this season. But I would say the Leafs are getting a better version of him than the Bruins did. So it cuts both ways. It's just on the experience and the sample that you choose to examine. You mentioned Freddie Anderson. I happen to be a big Freddie Anderson fan. I think he was much maligned here in Toronto. And you look at the Columbus series that he played in as an example. He was vilified for the Leafs losing that series. His goals against in that 5-game set was 1.7. And that was at a time when the Leafs offense was about as strong as it is right now. That's where the problem lies, not where Freddie Anderson underperformed or anything like that. He is, in fact, the 4th winningest all-time goalie in the history of the National Hockey League, not just Toronto, but every goalie who's ever played and earned more than 100 decisions. He ranks number 4 all time.
Right. And on that note, Mr. Paul Shields, over to you, because I know that we are in the midst of a great hockey conversation. So I want you to chime in some more, because I know how much you love hockey, especially playing your beer league hockey as often as possible throughout the week.
Sure. Well, I'll stick with the Leafs, or at least a Leafs adjacent story. We saw the men's Olympic team for Canada was unveiled today or yesterday. And we see Josh Hosang on there, who was sort of picked up off the scrap heap, for lack of a better term, with Kyle Dubas, and had his chance at a professional trial with the Leafs. He's been playing very well with the Marlies. Just curious if you have any thoughts on, the season that he's having and Josh Hosang going to the Olympics.
Well, I know there was some talk, Paul, about signing him to a contract with the Marlies that was tied to the NHL, a 2-way deal, but they thought they better wait on it just in case they do go this route and have to choose the Olympians from the AHL levels and below. So this was a nudge, wink, wink deal that's been in the background playing out. And I assure you that when the Olympics are over, Josh Hosang will get at least a 2-way tryout, and he'll be a part of the mix at training camp with a real shot to make the big club next year. He's been a good soldier. He was a very talented junior, but sometimes success and opportunity comes to us when we're a little immature between the ears, and that was the knock against him at that time. He's matured a lot. John Tavares has commented saying he played with him at training camps on the island, and he sees a very different, more mature version of Hosang now. But the skill was never in doubt, and he's shown that in the AHL, and that's what earned him the opportunity. And we're going to hear a lot more about this young man before too long, as possibly a real serious part of the Maple Leafs plans for the future.
What do you think about veteran NHLer Eric Staal getting an opportunity again with Team Canada? He is not signed with an NHL club, and he's been keeping in shape and skating and still working and things like that. He has done a lot and seen a lot in the game, as well as being on, I believe, the Vancouver Olympic team and different things like that throughout his career. But he arguably is the most veteran guy with the most experience, both in Stanley Cups and on the international stage, that was named to that team yesterday. Do you think that a 37-year-old Eric Staal can make an impact for Team Canada at the Olympics coming up in Beijing in a week's time?
I think he's going to make more of an impact off the ice around that team than he will on the ice. I'll say that. He's, like you said, he's got a lot of miles on him. He's been everywhere, played at the game at the highest level with all the chips on the table, and can impart that experience to the much younger, much more inexperienced of his teammates. And that's where I really see the truest part of his value. But he's still got something going on the ice. When he was playing in Iowa, I think it was in the AHL, he got 4 games with them. He had 5 points. So there's still some skill there. And he's a big body, big presence, and bigger than the average European player that he'll be facing. That's going to be something he'll play to his advantage as well. So I expect him to be an asset more off the ice and on, but he'll show flashes on the ice as well.
All right, we'll get you out of here on these last couple of things. First and foremost, because you have your hand in about 19 different pies at any given time, I want to give you the opportunity to plug some of the stuff that you got going on right now so that people can go and listen to you and read your columns and all that different stuff, because as they have witnessed over the last half an hour or so, you are a wealth of knowledge in a bunch of different areas. So where can people find you?
Well, I'm contracted to RotoWire, and they have a vast array of resources, not just for hockey, but every professional sport you can think of. And on a daily basis, we set lineups, we set rosters, we update injuries over there. And I pull that together on a weekly basis. I do that on a daily basis with a team, but then on a weekly basis, every Thursday, I have a podcast called Puckcast with Statsman and AJ. I'm the Statsman, as you probably can gather from all the numbers I threw out. But I've been doing this podcast for 7 years with RotoWire. We have thousands of listeners every week, and we run through all the rosters of the NHL teams and update our listeners who are in pools of various magnitudes and various types to tell you who's playing with whom, who's hurt, who's dealing with COVID, when they're coming back, and all that stuff. And I do that on a weekly basis. Then on a daily basis, I also work with DraftKings, which is a big player in the fantasy sports space. And on a daily basis, I'm part of a panel that previews all the game's actions for the upcoming nights. I do that Monday to Friday on the DraftKings show called The Sweat. And you can follow me on Twitter at Statsman22 to get links to all of that stuff.
And any Instagram, or you're not on Instagram?
Not on Instagram, not anything more than personal use. I try to keep that aside for personal use, but the Twitter handle is at Statsman22. Look me up at RotoWire. You'll see all the history of the podcasts that I've done, and I'll make sure to direct you to The Sweat, which is put on by DraftKings every morning from 11 o'clock to 12. And I appear on the hockey segment, but when the season's done here with the hockey, I'll be doing baseball for them too.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, can't get you out of here without asking you the same question that we ask all first-time guests here on the Isolation series, and that is, do you have a couple of Spence memories or a couple of Spence moments that stick out to you throughout the years? Because you and I have known each other for a long time, and it's one thing hearing it from my side, it's a whole other thing hearing it from the other person's side. So do you have a couple stories that you would like to share with the audience right now?
Well, Spencer, I know that you have a great Rolodex of contacts, and I've seen it up close and personal. The rapport that you have with David Ortiz, I saw it. The rapport that you have with Robbie Alomar, I've seen it many times, and they speak glowingly of you when you're not around. And maybe they won't do that in your presence, but I've heard them and I've asked them about you because I know them on a different level than you do too, not quite as intimately, but when I mention your name, they smile like you are right now. So that's the greatest thing that I can say about your relationship with a lot of the athletes that we love to cover and talk about.
Yeah, and thank you for that. But also, like, do you have any sort of specific personal story? Because you and I have worked together in different iterations, and we've known each other for a long time. Does any story stick out for you? That
Absolutely. We talked about one the other day, and you know, the whole world that you entertain, they know about the fact that you are physically disabled, but anything but when it comes to mentally, and you plow through that rigorously and with a verve that I don't think anybody can match, and that's admirable. I remember one time when we were supposed to do a show on the 6th floor of a building that I worked at with you downtown Toronto, and for a small radio station, and the elevator crapped out. Remember that?
Yes.
And we had to fold up your chair and carry you up the stairs, and you know, I'm sure that took a lot out of you, but we did a hockey pool that night, if I remember. Maybe it was a baseball pool.
It was a baseball pool, yes.
Yeah, and we had so many laughs, but it all happened because you were determined to get up those stairs, come hell or high water, and say, I'm not letting anything stop me. And that was just indicative of the person that you are, that you don't let anything stop you or get in your way. And I have the utmost admiration for what you've done with your life. And
why don't you explain to people, including the one and only Paul Shields over there, how shady the elevator was in that particular building? Because there's shady elevators, and then there's the one that broke down on that night.
Well, it was one of those deals where they didn't have a door that closed in the front, first of all. that had like a gate, if I remember correctly,
Yes.
and a pulley system that I thought, okay, I think I've seen these in the old Batman shows in the 1960s and 70s, where you thought, okay, if this cable breaks when we're halfway up, we're all goners. So
Yeah.
it was a risk every time you got on that thing. And I'll tell you what, parenthetically, I never took it if I could avoid it. I always ran up the stairs or walked up the stairs. I'm not in the best shape. I wasn't in the best shape of my life at the beginning of my time there, but I sure was better off after several times going up and down, and climbing those steps. I didn't want to take that elevator.
Right. Well, Paul Shields, do you have any other comments for the one and only Paul Bruno before we let him go? Or should we wrap it up right there, my friend?
No, yeah, as usual, Spence, I'm going to try and steal a little of your thunder and thank Paul so much for being here with us. Really appreciate the chat. I always love talking Leafs and hockey, so it's great to chat with you.
My pleasure too. Anything for Spencer, anytime, buddy.
Absolutely. And Paul, we're going to have you come back on a fairly semi-regular basis now that you've been on once, get you going on, once a month or once every couple months situation, just so that we can update people and talk about the new stuff and the new stats and everything like that. But definitely appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here on the Isolation Series for this Hump Day Wednesday, the 26th of January, which, by the way, on behalf of both Paul's and myself, I would be remiss if I did not say that today is the 12th annual Bell Let's Talk Day across Canada, shining a light on mental health in all different forms in sports and in life. And so, for those of you watching and or listening to today's episode and are suffering in any way with mental health, as we all do in one way or another at different points in our life, know that you are not alone, and know that more than ever before, mental health and the resources around mental health are available for you. And if you want to donate, go to belletstalk.ca and make sure you donate. All proceeds from text messages on Bell providers and things like that today go to Bell Let's Talk. And I know, Paul, that you have been around that since it started, like me, and it's something that you support greatly as well.
Yeah, I think that the stigma has to be taken off of the whole mental health issue. It was something that was not talked about openly as it is now, and that's a step in the right direction. It's just like any other issue that confronts us, whether it be physical or mental. It's just one of a library of things that we are part. It's part of the human condition, and we got to take the Band-Aid off and talk about it openly.
Yeah, and Mr. Shields, I know that you, very much like both of us, are very passionate about mental health and things like that. So I know I threw it over to you, and you said your last little bit here, but that is why my name is on the front of it, because we can change on the fly here a little bit. Do you want to say anything about the 12th annual Bell Let's Talk Day quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we do a good job on Bell Let's Talk Day of talking about mental health and really bringing it to the forefront and working to end the stigma. But I'd strongly encourage everyone to look into those charities in their communities that help to advocate for mental health every day of the year. This is a 365-day-a-year problem for some. Everybody struggles, some to large degrees, some to lesser degrees. But there are great communities out there that are supporting the mental health of everyone. So on the 364 other days that aren't Bell Let's Talk Day. So while I'm a huge advocate for today, and I've done my tweeting and my posting about it, I really encourage folks to continue this conversation after today.
For Paul Squared, aka Paul Bruno, the Stats Man, and Paul Shields, I'm the better looking one of the three of us, the one and only Spencer Miller. This has been the Isolation Series on Wednesday, January 26th, 2022, and we look forward to coming at you again with another fantastic episode tomorrow. But until then, again, happy Bell Let's Talk. It is not a stigma anymore, like they said. If you need help, definitely go out and get it in any way possible, and take care of yourselves and each other. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. And Paul, please tell people all about some more whole grain goodness that is us.
Folks, be sure to check us out on podbean.com by going to theisolationseries.podbean.com. There you'll find the audio-only versions of the podcast, including all of our past amazing interviews. One more time, that's theisolationseries.podbean.com. And hey, don't forget to follow us on Instagram. It's at @thespencermiller and at Pauly Shields, Pauly spelled Pawly. So find us on podbean.com, follow us on Instagram, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
And once again, everybody, thank you for watching and or listening and supporting this thing we like to call the Isolation Series. For Paul Shields, I am Spencer Miller, and we will see you again very, very soon. Bye-bye.